Okay, so the plan for today is Dr. Schmidt is running slightly late, so we're going to start with Mr. Rosenberg. He's going to give us an overview of the book and in particular kind of the general outline of Google Does and what he wants to talk about today. Then hopefully Dr. Schmidt will join us in about 10 minutes time, and then we'll move on to a Q&A session with me, which I will shorten, and that will allow you all to get your points across as well. So without further ado, and sorry for the wait, I would like to welcome Mr. Jonathan Rosenberg.
My pleasure. All right. Even Google Maps and Android couldn't get Eric here in time, but they're trying very hard.
Okay. So, as I said, I mean, would you like to give a short overview of what the book's about, the themes that you wanted to talk about today, and then we can go from there, really?
Sure. We'll do something different instead of the Q&A. So, let's see. The way I would kind of summarize the book, there's really kind of three forces that we believe have fundamentally made the world different today. And that's what caused us to write a book about a culture that was very different, an approach to innovation, decision-making, and communication that was very different. So let me try to frame the discussion in the Q&A that we're going to have when Eric gets here by explaining from sort of a Silicon Valley and technological perspective what we think is different today. There are three big factors that have changed. The internet, which makes information free and ubiquitous. Mobile, which makes reach and the ability for companies to distribute their products and get in charge with their customers free. The ability of individuals to get to each other and to communicate with each other free. And the third is cloud computing, which makes cheap computing cycles in the cloud free or cheap and available on a pay-as-you-go basis, and allows us to put much, much more power into client-side devices like wearables and phones for consumers. So why does it matter so much that these things are free? It matters because these are what I would call as an economist. My father was actually an economist who taught here from 1990 to 1991. If you look up Nathan Rosenberg, he actually signed the same book that I just did. But in economics, the factors of production are land, physical labor, and capital. And the new factors of production are information, which the internet makes free, reach and distribution, which mobile makes free, and computing power. With these three things, the only thing you need to actually produce products technologically today is an engineer who can program with them. So what happens is the new complementary scarce resource, when all of the other inputs into the production function are becoming abundant, is the engineer. And you can take much, much greater risks when all of these inputs are cheap and ubiquitous, and you need to manage in a completely different way when these inputs into your production function are no longer scarce. So all this stuff that used to cost a lot of money is free. What's also happening is it's changing much, much faster. So the internet, I believe, is sort of the third seminally grand general purpose technology that is changing the world. The first two were steam and electricity. But if you look at those previous grand general purpose technologies, they took decades before they actually manifested themselves in the form of products and services that changed the world. You know, steam was originally, the steam engine was originally for pumping water out of flooded mines. And it took 150 years before we hooked it up to locomotives and started conquering access to the rest of the world. Electricity actually took 30 years to replace steam because the boneheaded managers who managed steam didn't want to move to a new technology, and it took 30 years before electricity showed up. So what happened with the internet? We had the confluence of three things: a browser, TCP/IP, and HTML. And in the mid-90s, those things came on to the stage, and boom, very, very quickly, we had companies like Amazon and Yahoo and eBay all usurping the positions of existing players. So all of the changes today happen much faster, and they're driven by technological laws that that don't face the same sort of physical limitations that rates of change of technology used to be limited by. The new laws are Moore's law of processing power, where changes occur exponentially in just 4 or 5 years. We have similar laws for storage, Kreider's law with storage, and similar laws for rates of change of bandwidth. So all of these things are changing much, much faster. And the tools that we use to harness them have been completely democratized so that anybody has access to them. We now have open source software. We have abundant APIs into sets of information that are much more robust than we used to have. We have information not just like what's in a magazine or in a newspaper, but information about the weather, information about financial transactions, information about what people want to buy and what people want to sell. And all of these things can be connected much more expeditiously than they could in the past. So that's kind of the way I frame the input side of the manufacturing equation. But the consumer side is also completely different. The balance of power completely shifted from companies to consumers. You can no longer, if you're a company, win by dint of overwhelming marketing effort and overwhelming spending to try to convince people that your brand or your product is wonderful. People have access to, again, information which is free. They have access to their phones. They have access to reviews. And they can very, very easily find out whether or not the things that they want to buy are good or not. So the balance of power shifts to consumers. And then the number one thing that drives everything is whether or not your product is any good. Superior products have become by far the paramount factor. So it's the people who actually create these products that are the ones that actually matter. In the book, we call these people smart creatives. They're the kind of people who are highly technical. They also have they have business judgment. They're passionate. They're highly curious. They're the kind of engineer who actually can invent new things. And these people need to be managed differently than they're going to teach you in your MBA textbooks. How many of you are studying business economics or something like that? Good. Okay, so the stuff they teach you in those books is all wrong. It's all 20th century based. It's all based in an era when these inputs into the production function were expensive. So what did we teach management to do when we sort of built these hierarchical, vertically integrated, large 20th century companies? We taught management to limit risk, to limit the resources that we put into products before we actually released more resources and allowed people to develop on them. So the whole hierarchical approach to 20th century management is actually designed to slow decisions down. And it's slowing decisions down in this unique moment in time when everything is speeding up, everything is accelerating. So that was sort of the framework that Eric and I realized we were faced with when we came to Google. The hierarchical model is slowing things down, everything is moving much faster, and the engineers are the main factor that matter. The only opportunity cost that we have is the time of the engineers. So what we realized was we fundamentally needed to invent a new way of doing management and throw out the traditional rule book. We needed to figure out how to give these engineers much more freedom as opposed to telling them how to think. We had to manage the environment in which they think. So our book really focuses on the cultural dynamics in the environment that they think, the approach that we take to strategy, a much more fluid approach to planning as opposed to the traditional rigid approaches, a different approach to decision making, communications, and innovation. So that's sort of the framework of what the book is about and has given Eric almost enough time to join me in this seat.
Okay, so linked to that, you talked about how managing Google made you realize how all of these management techniques were wrong. Was there a particular moment when everything switched in your head and you realized that?
Oh, there were many moments. I think probably the seminal moment that had the greatest impact on me was about 3 months after I started. So I had an MBA too from a different school. I went to the University of Chicago, but I was very proud of it. It's on my wall somewhere. And in business school, they taught us how to write plans, right? And they were the traditional 20th century kind of gate-based product plans. You know, there's concept phase, investigation phase, development phase, and you release more resources as you go along. So I wanted to be valued and do a good job, so I wrote a really good one. And I printed it out and I put it on Larry Page's desk. And he opens it. That was the first mistake, because I should have emailed it to him, because he doesn't like anything printed. So he had a negative bias coming in. But he opens up the document and he starts looking at these graphs and charts. And he says, "What is this?" And I'm like, oh, he's going to be really impressed. He's never seen a PERT chart. He goes to the next page. He says, "What's this?" Like, he hasn't seen a Gantt chart. So I decided I'm going to start explaining to him what these things are. And he immediately says, "Well, when did you ever produce a schedule and have engineers who developed the product faster than the schedule that you handed them?" I was like, "Well, never." He says, "When did you ever make a list of features that they were to produce and they put special new features in and surprised you with what a great job they did?" And I said, "Well, never." And he said, "Your plans are really stupid. My engineers don't want them." That was when I realized that fundamentally I needed to take a completely different approach. And what Larry actually ordered me to do at that point was leave my office and just go sit with the engineering teams and talk to them about the things that they wanted to do and the vision that we had for the products.
Okay. So both yourself and Eric, I think we can safely say you're both quite financially successful. So what kind of what motivated you to write the book in the first place?
Well, I think both Eric and I, initially, the title of the book was something like Slaying Giants, you know, usurping the position of large, big established companies with the new management rules of the internet century. So we actually wrote the book initially because we wanted to share with the next entrepreneur, the next Larry and Sergey, the next person in a garage, the next engineer or kid in a dorm room who was trying to build a company, our understanding of kind of the rules as we evolve them, and also specifically not just the rules about how to start a company, but the rules about how to start a company that actually scales with these principles. And then we got a publisher really excited about the book, and the brilliant publisher said, "Well, there's just not that many of those people in a dorm or in a garage to write for. You should actually write the book in a way that an existing manager in a large company could also use the book to try to ensure that the startups who are coming after them aren't successful." So we ended up actually with a modest mission and then expanded it to a larger mission because we wanted to sell books.
So Apple and Facebook today have actually just been in the news about the fact that they are offering female employees opportunities to freeze their eggs to better allow them to focus on their current projects. Is that something Google would ever consider? And what do you think about more generally the work-life balance that suggests?
Well, I did just see that news on the way over. And I think Apple and Facebook are unfairly vilified for offering women that option. In economics, we are taught that an option can never have negative value. So I'm always offended when the reaction to offering somebody an option is, well, the downside of offering people this option is it will cause us to be less friendly about the work environment and demand that women who otherwise would have kids delay it. That's bad. Apple and Facebook shouldn't do that. Google should certainly consider maintaining benefits that are competitive with its counterparts. But I don't see how offering people an option has negative value or can actually will adversely impact them. I think you need to help women, and if people want to freeze their eggs and that's a reasonable benefit, then that seems like a reasonable thing for me to do. In the book, we sort of talk about overworked in a good way, and we observe that to us, kind of, Eric and I don't really have a work-life balance. I mean, we work all the time. And we think many of our employees are the kind of employees who just wish they had 26 hours in a day, and they don't. So we give them the option of working when it suits them. I think Marissa Mayer, who used to work for me and now runs Yahoo, said, burnout comes from the resentment of being told what to do and when to do it. So we never do that. We tell people what we need them to accomplish, and then they figure out how and where and when they're going to actually accomplish it.
Okay, we're gonna, I think, how do you feel about opening it up a little bit, allowing questions from the audience?
Sure.
Are there any questions just straight off? Yeah, down at the front.
So obviously you talk about Google in these terms of innovating in this new tech market, and nobody can deny that Google has been one of the most innovative companies. I don't think there's anyone that associates a web search browser with anything other than the word Google to the point it's become a sort of phrase in the English lexicon. I mean, no one says, I'm just going to Bing that search for a second. It never happens. So what do you see as the sort of next sort of major field in the next 5 to 10 years that is a source of perhaps viable technological innovation?
Sure. Well, I think probably the biggest and most significant grand secular shift in the world is the shift to mobile. I think what's so exciting about that is, you know, we call these things phones, but they're not phones. They're supercomputers in your pocket connected to the cloud over high-speed networks. So I think we're going to see a profound shift to more work being done on these smaller devices. I think the most significant impact that that's going to have technologically is we've got 2.5 billion people in the developing world coming online via smartphones who are unlike the rest of us. If you guys think about what owning a smartphone meant for you, you know, most of you probably grew up here. You had access to a library, you had access to a newspaper, you had access to a doctor. Imagine for the set of people that didn't have any of those things and now are skipping all of that. Suddenly they can participate in the discourse with their government. They can understand scientific issues that they weren't aware of. You know, they can run searches on crop rotation, how to build a well, how to address a particular medical condition. So I think mobile, both for the developed world and the developing world, is by far the biggest change. I think the other kind of things that we're working on at Google that are sort of that are big and significant, we're certainly working on connectivity for the developing world with the Loon, the balloon project. I think we're going to see huge change if you go to 10 years instead of 5 years in self-driving cars. I've been driven by one of these cars, and it's really pretty epic. They work, they don't get drunk, they don't get distracted. They have a laser that sees the bumper of the car ahead of them instantly, and they hit the brake faster than any human possibly can. So I think we'll see huge changes there. And I think the third biggest area that we'll see significant change in is healthcare. We have a project now that's a smart contact lens, and it actually measures, it has a tiny computer chip and battery in it, and it actually measures your glucose level. So diabetics can be informed much more expeditiously and properly of their glucose. I think anything that marries longitudinally tracking health-related information, which we're going to see on our wrists, which we're going to carry with us, is going to have huge value. And I think when you aggregate all that data from a healthcare perspective, both in terms of longitudinally tracking an individual's health information, but also the pharmaceutical and genetic research implications of designer drugs, you're going to see vast, vast improvements that are going to fundamentally change people's lives.
Any other questions? At the very back there. Just in front of the camera.
Hi, so you talked about how Google moved towards sort of a more bottom-up, engineer-driven management structure. That sounds like something that makes sense when a company's fairly small, but I'm wondering if that still works and how you've had to change it now that Google's a multi-billion-dollar company with people spread all across the world.
Sure. I think most of the principles that we espouse in the book are reasonably consistent at this scale. They're just much, much harder to implement. One of the things which Eric can talk to you about when he gets here is we've always been very, very focused on kind of maximizing communication and maximizing transparency with employees. So I think all of the rules that we talk about with respect to openness and with respect to transparency of innovation or information scale to just about any size. We share the board letter, which we write for the board with all of our 50,000 employees every single quarter. Eric actually presents it. All employees share all of their what we call OKRs, which are objectives and key results, with each other. It's available on the intranet on our internal server. I think most of the rules, we actually have a lot of rules if you read the book about how we make decisions, how we run meetings, how we make sure that we're very inclusive of everyone in the decision-making process, how we give people 20% time, and how we allocate resources across the engineering organization. I think we're very, very consistent with those things. I think the hardest thing to change in a company, in a big company, is culture. If you don't set culture correctly and people sort of aren't bought into the mission from the start, it gets very difficult to change the culture. But if you set that correctly early, then I think it becomes easier to sort of maintain that as you scale. You just need to spend more management time putting more effort into it. Actually, one of the other reasons that we wrote the book is for Google. There are lots of people, I realize I stepped down from the role running Google products in April of 2011, and I was just presenting today to our team in London, and I looked out in the room and I didn't recognize anybody. And someone told me that more than half of the people in the room had been hired since 2011 when I stopped running product management for Google. So hopefully the book, which we're sharing with the rest of the world, is also useful in helping sort of continue the trajectory of that culture.
Okay, brilliant. So I would also now just like to welcome Dr. Eric Schmidt to...
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, nice to see you. Thank you. Hi, Jonathan.
Sorry about the weather. You haven't missed much. You've heard me before. You came in much later, and they clapped much louder. That's the update.
Thank you, Jonathan. I apologize for being late. It took 2 hours to get in from London,
I
entirely due to the weather.
Okay, so this is a very general question, actually. I understand Google's company motto is "Don't be evil." What does that actually mean on a day-to-day basis? And also, why wasn't it "do good" rather than "don't be evil"?
You will answer this question.
Don't be evil sounds more trenchant.
Fair. Anything else? What does that mean on a day-to-day basis? I mean,
Well, it's easier if I describe it as a story. I assumed, all the companies that I've worked in, they've had these marketing phrases that people sort of nodded to, but they didn't actually do anything. And I'm sitting in the room a couple months into my first year at Google, and there's a conversation about mixing ads and answers in a certain way. And one of the engineers, his name Ron, takes his fist and throws it on the table and says, "That's evil." I didn't know quite what to do. It's like, a pronunciation has occurred, a pronouncement has occurred. And the entire conversation stopped, and then there was a lengthy discussion as to whether this idea was evil. It was ultimately canceled. And I realized all of a sudden that that's what "don't be evil" means. It was a way for an employee, in this case just a normal engineer, to say, I don't want to be part of that. And it's a way of sort of framing the debate. It's interesting that it's become a problem at some level because Google is, as a public company, judged on standards that are higher than normal corporations. So although we use it internally to justify our own decision making, it's now seen, it's sort of seen as arrogant in that it arrogates a higher power to us, and therefore we are held to a higher standard, which is not necessarily a bad thing.
Okay. In your book, you wrote a little bit about the internal discussions that took place with regards to Google in China. You obviously took the decision to leave. Is that one that you ever regret? Or would you like to talk a little bit more about the state of mind that went into that call?
Why don't you start? You were there and I was there.
Well, I was there because I was summoned at 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon.
Sunday afternoon.
And We really use the example in China to illustrate our approach to decision making, which we call decide with data, beware the bobble-headed yes, and know when to ring the bell. And Eric used this, which was a seminally critical decision that the company needed to make, to sort of model for his management team the approach that we take to decision making. So we came in and Sergey presented to us the data that he had on the hacking that we had experienced, and we went through all of the data rather painstakingly, and Eric then went around the room and forced each of us that were just sort of, nodding our heads to actually engage in the conversation, state our opinions, and argue. And we argued for a while, and eventually I think Eric said he set a deadline. He said, we're all going to go home tonight. And by about 10 o'clock we had come to the decision, but we'd followed a model that I think all of us remember to this day, which is every one of us participated in it and were part of the decision. So that was the framework from my perspective.
So we had a vote, and the majority voted to, in fact, pull out of mainland China.
Yes, I didn't support you in the vote.
And everyone gets to decide whether their private vote is public, Jonathan, or not. They've now figured out something about you and about me.
Only if you tell them your side.
The important thing was that I kind of knew what was going to happen because I had polled the two founders ahead of time, and I knew where they were. But I thought it important to have an official event internally where the company made a decision. And you don't get a good decision unless everybody participates and everybody has a clear deadline. By the way, if you just allow people, I had worked at Novell where there was this principle that I used to call the Novell nod, which meant that we would all sit around and we would all go, and then we would leave and do exactly what we wanted. In other words, there was no conformity. I developed an opinion that the best way to manage things was to start by having a discussion or an argument or whatever you want to call it. And often in a meeting, there's 2 or 3 of the executives talk all the time, and a number of them say relatively little. And on balance, the men talk more than the women. And so I sort of developed a view that you should let the fast men, if you will, speak, but then call on some of the other people who inevitably had more thoughtful, more reasoned, and more well-positioned arguments, in my view. And if you can get a controversy going, well, now you've got a real debate. Now, if you do nothing beyond that, you have a university, which debates and debates and debates and debates, right?
They're really good at that here.
Right? You need a deadline. You need a clear decision point. And the job of the executive, in this case, me as CEO, was to have a deadline. And even if I didn't agree with the decision, it was important that there be a decision that everyone could move forward in a coherent and organized way. Because you're moving a large set of people, a large set of products, a lot of things happen as a result of a decision right here and there. And I think that intuitively that makes sense. And when you're making important decisions, it's important that everybody understand that it is an important decision to be reasoned and so forth. In the China case, I think in hindsight, there were legitimate arguments on both sides. And the people who wanted to stay were willing to put up with the horrific censorship to benefit the Chinese citizens. The people who wanted to leave thought that the horrific censorship made it impossible to work with the Chinese government. Since we left, which was in January of 2010, the censorship has gotten worse. The Chinese internet has largely been developed, and it's been largely developed without American technology.
So if you parse all of the negatives, you can actually figure it out where we stood. He didn't agree with the decision, and I didn't agree with him.
Okay, very.
These people are smart, Jonathan. They already figured this out.
Again, I'm going to open it up a little bit
Sure.
again to the audience. Are there any in particular? Yeah, young lady there.
So my question is, since Megan Smith just moved to the White House from Google, what do you hope she accomplishes or moves forward in technology policy in the next couple of years? And specifically, do you think Larry Page made a comment about how if fear of data mining didn't exist, we could save 100,000 lives a year? Do you think that's an area you hope she can move forward in the next couple of years?
So there are really 2 separate questions there. So Megan worked at Google for a decade. And during that time, she had an enormous career, right, at Google, and we miss her. She did a number of things, including do our philanthropic efforts. She ran much of our public policy stuff, and she ran a large number of new startup initiatives. So this is a very, very talented executive. So she's just started in Washington. I met with her 3 weeks ago, I think a week after she started. And she had that, I'm an optimist and I'm in Washington, D.C. tone, which in my experience fades. So nevertheless, she has taken on with her typical energy the challenges of getting the US government to be more aware of information technology, modernizing the systems, working on technology policy and those kinds of things. She works for the group of which I'm a member, something called PCAST. So, but she has enormous energy and she'll make a difference. The separate question that you asked had to do with data mining. And the easiest example for you all to understand, and I'll pick one which is sort of controversial in Britain, and it's the National Health Service. Now, because of the National Health Service, you all happen to have a very large cohort of medical outcomes data. Most people believe that if that data were securely and properly analyzed, you could invent some new treatments for some very serious diseases. Many people are also very concerned that by aggregating all that data, there would be a very significant loss of privacy. And there is a debate going on in this country right now over that. Now, I don't want to speak for Larry, but I can say that most technology people, given the choice of saving lives and attempting to keep the privacy in check and do a good job there, we want to save lives. Because lives actually matter. Privacy matters too. But there's a lot of evidence that something like a big data store around health could be very useful. I wrote, along with some others for the White House, a technical report on this question of the big data privacy issue. And the report was fairly mixed and fairly non-conclusive. But what it basically said was that there's an enormous amount of data being collected about people, that it's difficult to escape it even with anonymization techniques. Again, this is what the White House report said. And that we should all work hard to fight for our own privacy. And indeed, in the first book I did with Jared Cohen, we say specifically you should fight for your privacy or you lose it. So how do you reconcile those two things? I think it's up to you as citizens and with your government.
Okay. So as Google, on the privacy point, would you apply that same principle to requests from, for example, the NSA or GCHQ?
Well, neither the NSA nor the GCHQ made a request. They just attacked us.
Okay. And that's what you have a problem with, I'm guessing.
Wouldn't you?
Yeah, fair.
If you found the GCHQ and the NSA wandering through your clothes and drawers and so forth, it would bother you. Without a warrant, without a police action. Maybe it's okay here, but it's not okay with me. So we're clear. What's interesting is that So the facts are the following. The GCHQ, which works for the British government, took the links between the servers that we have and put themselves in the middle of it and watched our communication between our servers, which I would argue is roughly the same thing as opening up your laundry drawers at home in your private bedroom kind of thing. And they reverse engineered our protocols. We know this because of the Snowden revelations. When we saw that, one, we complained, and they, of course, didn't respond. I guess they're not required to. And we then changed our algorithms to use very, very detailed encryption called 2048-bit encryption. The technical people in the room know what I'm talking about. And 2048-bit keys are effectively unbreakable in our lifetimes. And so we believe now that it's not possible to go through our drawers, if you will. We've also fully encrypted all the data on Google servers at rest. So if you wouldn't do this, but let's say you happen to go take one of our servers and steal it, you would not be able to take the data off of it and make any good use of it. Our encryption use has been so thorough that it has caused a major set of complaints in America by the FBI director. And my attitude is, you shouldn't have done this stuff, guys. Neither the NSA nor the GCHQ acknowledges that they did these things, although it's well established that they did. And in my private meetings with the head of the GCHQ and the NSA, I won't say what they said to me, but I can tell you what I said to them, which is just because you can technically do it does not mean that it was a good idea.
Yeah. So to continue that point, if they were to come to you with a warrant which also required that you keep it secret, does that imply that you would allow them access?
Well, and again, there's a very technically, I have to be very careful in this because people care a lot about these things.
Yeah.
And let me tell you the legal and technical procedure for this. There's something called a FISA court, which was set up in America, and I think there are analogous courts in the UK. A FISA court can issue a warrant by a secret set of judges. The existence of that warrant is secret and we cannot disclose it. Were we to receive one of those warrants, we are required to turn over any data on that particular individual who's typically a terror suspect, and we do so. Until recently, it was illegal for us to tell you the number of such warrants we receive. And thank goodness the government can now allow me to tell you that that number is on the order of 10,000. And that number, by the way, is off of a user base of some number of billions. So the odds, the reason we want to say that number is that the odds of any of you being subject to this are highly unlikely. First, none of you, highly likely. It is Oxford. It's highly unlikely for a number of reasons. First, you're not a terrorist. And second, even if you were, which you're not, right, the numbers are very small. And the reason I wanted to give, I pardon giving such a precise answer, is this is at the root of much of the scaremongering and fear that's happening in Europe. So to be very clear, Google does not collaborate with the NSA or the GCHQ. We've never turned over anything except under this legal process, and I've just described that legal process, and they were not going to change that policy. I also believe that the safest place that you all can put your data is on a Google server right now. I really believe that, and I'll tell you why. There's no other company that can represent to you in the technical details that I just did of all the things we do that your information is safe from all these other activities.
Any other questions? So the young man, third row back on this side.
The European Union has recently ruled out that if data about certain persons is unrelevant or outdated, that it should be removed on request if the law or the lawyers think so as well. What is your opinion about the fact that some of the data available to the general public via Google now can be hidden from the public? And do you think that this is a good thing or not?
This is generally known as the right to be forgotten. And the European Court of Justice in June had a finding which said the following. It said that if you're not a public figure and if the information is not of general interest, it commands Google to receive an application from you and to take that information out of Google while leaving it up in, for example, a newspaper. Google does not like this ruling. However, we are forced to comply with it. So we started in late June to comply. Here are the numbers. 146,000 requests have been made, covering about 500,000 links. There's a set that are obviously one way and obviously another. So for example, we had the convicted pedophile who wanted all that information taken down. We kept it up. We've also had people who've had private medical records disclosed by mistake. We took those down. And the problem we're having is that there are many ones in the middle because the court does not define what the term means. They don't say what a public figure is. So for example, if you were a public figure and you're no longer in office, are you still a public figure? Those kinds of things. So we convened a group called the Right to be Forgotten Council, which is meeting tomorrow here in London to hear testimony from experts on how we should do that. Google's opinion and my personal opinion is that this is not such a good idea because it does constitute censorship. Nevertheless, it's the reality, and I also believe that this will be the law for a very long time. This ruling does cover Britain, and it therefore covers you. So if you are not a public figure and you have something that you do not like on the web, you have the ability to follow our process.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah. Sorry, Olivia.
A recent court ruling in the US has compelled Microsoft to give over data held on an Irish server to in a US court investigation. What is your opinion of this and the US having jurisdiction over other countries' stuff? And how would Google respond to a situation like that of LavaBit, where it would
I've
have
learned
to
that these
give over?
hypotheticals are very dangerous because there's a lot of assumptions in a hypothetical. First place, I'm not familiar with the Microsoft request. I'll look at it, so thank you for pointing it out. As I understand US law, if a FISA court gives us an order, that applies to all operations of Google outside of the US as well as outside and inside the US. We would have to follow the law, but we'll have to check.
Just on front row here, Olivia, guy with the tweed jacket.
Hey, people seemed very upset when they found out about the NSA and GCHQ snooping on their data. But you guys have that data too, and you arguably have more resources. And now with the growth of Google into lots of different sectors, you have a lot of data on people. And I want to ask why you think that people trust you with their data when they're so upset with the NSA or GCHQ having their data?
My own opinion is it has to do with the level of control and regulation over companies versus the government. Because of the veil of secrecy, the GCHQ and the NSA operate under the military secrecy, which may or may not be needed, but nevertheless that's how they operate. Whereas Google's activities are subject to numerous legal challenges, regulatory challenges, press challenges, and so forth. And so it may very well be that the data that we collect is limited by sort of good judgment. If Google were to do any of the kinds of things that you're describing that we could do, one, we wouldn't do it. Two, it would be really bad. Three, we would be destroyed in the press. Four, our customers would leave. And finally, we'd get regulated and we'd get sued. So we won't do them.
Just to follow up on the previous discussions and the previous questions on regulation, given the important role that regulation plays, how actively or how proactively should a tech-driven company like Google engage in the public discussion and try to shape or influence the public opinion and also the political decision makers?
I would say it's a reality now for American firms, both in the United States and outside. I'll give you a US story. There was a group and a proposed law that would have criminalized a certain amount of content on the content in the US. This is known as the SOPA-PIPA law, and it was about to sail through Congress through heavy lobbying from the Motion Picture Association. The Internet Association, which was sort of behind on this, organized and actually held a day-long protest and so forth and stopped the bill. Had the bill passed, it would have put a very significant change in the way the internet worked on the burden of internet companies. So I think the reality is the information industry is so important that people do want to regulate it for many reasons, sometimes good and sometimes not so good. A lot of the conversations are really more education. What do you really do? And we have all sorts of false claims. They'll say, you do this with people. No, we don't. We do this. We don't. You do this? No, we don't. And these are legal challenges, so we have to tell the truth. We can't lie about it.
The young lady just on this hand, second row back.
Thank you for coming in today. My question relates to Jonathan. When you first said, when you joined Google, I think you gave Larry Page the business plan, and he said, it changes over time so much and it's hard to predict with engineers. So my question to both of you is, how has your vision changed for Google throughout the years, and what kinds of people or events influence that change?
So I think the biggest change that surprised me the most was the rate of adoption of mobile. I'd previously worked on a number of sort of failed mobile devices. I was the product manager for information services on the Newton, and I think it surprised me how quickly we ended up with this confluence of factors that made these devices so much more powerful. When we first had kind of the vision for the smartphone, which the Newton was, it didn't have the processing power, it didn't have the display capabilities, it didn't have the battery life, we didn't have the kind of cell networks, and we didn't have cloud computing. So in the space of a very short period of time, all of those things came together, and I think the rate at which those things came together surprised me. I think the other thing that surprised me was I always sort of had this vision that convergence was going to be about everything going to one perfect device that was going to be the device that I had that solved all of my problems. And it actually turns out that convergence has been keeping all of your data in the cloud and having access to it from a myriad of devices. A device on your wrist, ultimately devices like Google Glass, maybe in 20 years a chip that sits in your brain. So my biggest surprises have been how quickly that all changed as the networks evolved and as the connectivity evolved and as all of Moore's law and Kreider's law sort of storage kind of came about and made these things much, much more powerful very, very quickly.
And I think for me, the biggest impact has been the adoption of apps on mobile, following up on Jonathan's point. I think all of us understood cloud computing, back-end servers, web programming, web platforms, even these devices. We talked about this a lot. But the rapid adoption of mobile apps based on Objective-C and Java on Android and iOS, it really does define your generation. So for those of you that are going to graduate and going to become entrepreneurs, you will be building software that will be phone-based, that will talk to the back-end cloud servers in everything you do. That is as profound a change as the adoption of the PC industry or the mainframe industry. Just that middle right there.
Now my question is concerning the kind of tips that you would give to entrepreneurs. It said that Google revolutionized business in the model you adopted, which is we'll make a good product and we'll think about the profits after. And it has become a sort of paradigm in entrepreneurship and startup businesses that the core idea is to provide customer value and the profits will follow. Now the question is this: how long do you think that a startup entrepreneur can follow this seek to create customer value? At which point do you just have to realize that you also have to make a profit?
Sure. So I think, first of all, I think financing is much more plentiful today than it was than it used to be. So it's much easier to get financing today. I think the other thing that's different today is, when we talked about this a little earlier in my opening remarks, it's much easier for an engineer today to produce a demo and to produce a prototype, and it's much easier to get distribution because you don't need to spend as much money on marketing. So I would argue that today, if you build an app, right, if you build Angry Birds or you build Waze, and you get to the point where you can show people what your app can do, you can then very quickly convince people to invest in it. And I think with ad networks like the one Google has built, most of these apps and most of these eyeballs can be monetized reasonably well if you can get very, very large numbers of people to adopt your app. So the metric that I would focus on is whether or not, when initially you build a product for the end user, you're getting natural adoption on the web or in an app store from lots and lots of people signing up for your product. If the answer to that question is yes, somebody will fund it for you.
And I'd like to attack the core thesis of your question, which is that you have to make a profit. Let me give you an example of Amazon. If you look at over the 20 years of Amazon's existence, the majority of its profits have come from Amazon Web Services. And its margins are so thin, right? The distribution costs are so great, transport and so forth and so on, that it essentially is a break-even company. By the way, this is a corporation that's worth more than 100 billion US dollars. So somehow when we all go to business school and they say, oh, you have to have this profitability and so forth, maybe these assumptions are not so true anymore. In the mobile phone space, there's a company in China called Xiaomi, which famously markets its products by having no marketing at all and pricing them at manufacturing cost with no marketing overhead. And they market by the fact that they have no marketing. And they appear to be wildly successful, we'll see. So along with the other things that Jonathan talked about, I think there are possible financial models where they are essentially fast-growing companies with relatively little profits, and I offer those two as examples.
Just there on the front.
Okay, earlier on you mentioned the fact that Google has undertaken some initiatives in terms of the balloon, whereby you have internet access for people in the developing world. But aside that, what other initiatives is Google looking at? Considering the fact that most of the technology that you talk about, you still need broadband access, but a larger percentage in the developing world really don't have access to this broadband access you talk about. So what looking at probably from a policy point of view or technology point of view, what are the steps Google is taking in that direction concerning the developing world especially?
We announced in India 2 weeks ago a new version of Android that's specifically targeted for low-cost developing markets. I think we all believe that the unsubsidized price of these phones will be roughly $100, falling to $70, falling to $50. So I think we have a good answer for the hardware cost. When you talk to people, however, that's not where the expense is. The expense is in the telecommunications infrastructure, largely which are controlled by PTTs that are monopolies. And so my position is pretty simple. If you want to have competitive telephony, you have to have properly priced telephony. You have to have real competitors in your countries. We did an analysis for this, and it turns out that in many of the worst sort of countries to be from, the only legal and profitable business to be in is telecommunications.
Can we go at the back, Olivia? You can just...
Do you feel at all threatened by Samsung's move to Tizen rather than Android? And did this have any impact on your decision to sell Motorola, as some have speculated?
So I'm not sure I entirely heard the question. The question was about Samsung's move to Tizen and the decision with respect to selling Motorola.
Were we threatened by that?
Well, I think clearly Android is an open system. We've done well by making Android open. When you want to build a platform that's open, you need to do everything you can to ensure that the incentives are correct for all players. I think Samsung at the moment both has the option of going much more aggressively towards Tizen and staying less aggressive with the Sense UI and just focusing on iteratively building that on top of Android. I think Motorola has contributed greatly to the overall ecosystem in the sense that we brought the price of smartphones down significantly, which is largely going to benefit our penetration in the third world. But I think it does help in terms of getting more players into the ecosystem that Google is no longer perceived as owning one of the largest 5 manufacturers in the space.
We have time for a couple more questions, so we'll have the guy with the phone shining, and then outside the final one.
So I have a question related to counterfeit medicine search results. There are quite a lot of studies showing that up to 97% when you query for medicine line is from fake pharmacies selling counterfeit medicine with no active ingredient, and a lot of deadly cases attributable to rat poison and floor paint. Do you think it's the moral responsibility of Google to prevent consumers from this threat? Or do you think it's the consumer's own role if they query for medicine buy online and the first 3 results are all from fake medicines and they die because of purchase there?
This is a new issue for me, so I'm sorry I don't know the details. The particular area of medical advertisement is heavily regulated, and so if what you're describing is occurring, On the advertising side, it's, I'm sure, I'm sorry, this is on the ad side or the organic side?
Organic.
So you'll need to give me, can you give me an example of a query that produces such an outcome?
Buy Viagra online is something that's up to 97%.
So this is true for Viagra. Are there other drugs, or is it specific to that one?
Antidepressants, very high.
Antidepressants and Viagra. I will take a look. With respect to the organic side, as opposed to ads, so I'm going to distinguish between the two, the ads are heavily regulated, and we comply with that. On the organic side, we don't muddle with the search results, but I would be surprised if what you said is true in terms of our top rated, and I'll check it.
So now we just have time for one final question. We'll go for the young gentleman here.
Google's quite a massive, wide-range company that covers many, many things. But who would you see as your sort of, in any market, your main competitor, and why does Google have an upper edge over who you identify as your main competitors?
Well, it's interesting that I answered this question in a way that was surprising to people Monday evening in Berlin in a speech that's online. And what I said was that the real competitor for Google is in fact Amazon. And that surprised people, but when we look at product search and search in general, virtually all of the interesting commercial searches start from Amazon or an Amazon-like company, and that's an important competitive space. It's highly, highly competitive, which is good, drives prices down, gives people choices. Historically, of course, we've competed with the Microsoft Bing product, but I think the new competition today is probably Amazon. The future competition will be how applications work, right? Will you be doing Google search and so forth through apps, or will you be doing other things? And we don't know.
Okay. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for this afternoon. And thank you all for coming today. And finally, I would like you all to join me in thanking Eric and Jonathan for coming along this evening. Thank you.